When people think about dungeon design, we often talk about monsters, the denizens that lurk in our dungeons. Or we talk about the traps, these dastardly devices left by monsters or former occupants to stop the intruders. And we talk about treasures, the valuables that the players delve the dungeons for in the first place, the precious artifacts guarded by those monsters and traps. But we rarely talk about the other element that makes dungeons interesting. They make them interactive and immersive for our players. They help put the fantastical into our fantasy role-playing games. I'm talking about tricks, of course. Hi, welcome back aboard the Earthmote. I'm Randall. Today we're talking about what dungeon tricks are, what types of tricks you can use in your dungeons, and what makes for a good trick to implement into our dungeons. Tricks are kind of hard to explain because they're a little bit messy. And I think that's why we don't see a lot of discussion in modern dungeon design videos or articles about them. But despite that, I think that we use tricks fairly often. And you probably use tricks in your dungeons even if you've never heard of that term before. In researching this video, I found that tricks occupy a large area of design space for developing our dungeons, but thankfully there are some classifications that we can use to kind of categorize different tricks that we might want to implement in our dungeons, and we'll go through those a little bit later in the video. According to Matt Finch, designer of Swords and Wizardry, a trick is something that requires the players to make meaningful choices, but isn't a trap or a monster. That's still a pretty vague description. In researching this video and looking at other sources, I found many tricks that do employ trap or monster elements to them. So as I said, this does get a bit gray and messy, but we don't really need to overthink it too much. I think tricks are a really important element of our dungeon design because they really enhance the exploration component of our dungeons. If your dungeon is a series of monsters, traps, and treasure, that's fine, but I do think we're leaving a big opportunity left on the table. Tricks let you add more depth to the nature of your dungeon design, and they give your players the opportunity to use skills, magic, or items that are useful in the non-combat design space. Tricks can also be used to afford the players opportunities to bypass different scenarios or dangerous situations in your dungeons. Or maybe give them a big advantage in facing them. Maybe solving a puzzle opens up a secret pathway that lets the players bypass the crypts with a lot of dangerous undead lurking in it. Or maybe the puzzle reveals a magic holy symbol that enhances their turn undead abilities, thus giving them an advantage in facing those undead in the crypts. Before we go further, let's try to break down the components of a trick so we have kind of a sense of what they contain. Now keep in mind, not all tricks are going to follow these rules or contain every single one of these elements, but that's fine. This is just to give us kind of a general sense of what tricks are and how we might think about designing them when we're implementing them in our dungeons. First, most tricks are going to be visible to the players in the dungeon. Unlike traps, which are meant to be concealed and surprise the players, tricks are often visible and given to the players for free, such as when they walk into a room and receive the description of the room's contents, they'll likely see some element of the trick immediately at play in the room. Generally, the visible nature of the trick can often present clues or hints to the players about how the trick might work or how they can go about manipulating it. An example of this would be visible levers on the walls in a room full of different force fields. Some force fields block the way to a treasure, some block the way to a threat, and others block a way to an exit from the room. So pulling on the levers is likely to bring down one or more of these force fields at a time. The trick is there to offer the players a choice. The players can choose to interact with the trick, and in return, something is going to happen. Tricks can have a beneficial or negative outcome. The outcome can always be preset, like maybe drinking from a tainted well is always going to make the players feel sick and nauseous. But if they choose to purify it, then drinking it offers a minor healing benefit. The outcome can be completely randomized, like stepping on a malfunctioning teleportation circle might send the players off to a randomly determined room within the dungeon. And depending on the trick, if the players succeed, they will have a good outcome, whereas if they fail, they could have a bad outcome. Say, for example, a statue offers the players a riddle. If the players successfully solve the riddle, it moves aside and reveals a hidden passageway. Whereas if they fail at solving the riddle, it instead dispenses a poisonous gas into the chamber. So really, we have an element where there is information that is visible to the players. The players are faced with some sort of choice, and that choice results in an outcome that is either beneficial or negative for the players. Speaking of tricks, did you know that you can trick the YouTube algorithm by hitting the like button, and consider subscribing to the channel if you want to see more content and videos like this in the future? Now that we've talked about the structure of a trick, let's take a deeper look at the different categories of tricks that we can employ into our dungeons. As I mentioned, because tricks encompass such a large area of design space, there's likely to be some overlap within these categories, and that's totally fine. Using the Tome of Adventure Design by Matt Finch, he categorizes tricks into 11 different categories, and I think they work pretty well, so we'll go through those now and discuss them. Architectural tricks, these are tricks where the central feature is something architectural, like an alcove, an archway, or a wall. The architectural element can be manipulated in some manner, and as a result, something changes. The most obvious here is that it reveals a passageway or access to a new area, but it can also be something like revealing a treasure or dispensing a key that the players can use later in the dungeon. Bargain and persuasion tricks. These types of tricks involve the players interacting with another thing or being. They hope to gain some sort of advantage, but in return, they're going to have to bargain or give something up. The interaction can be with a living thing or inanimate. That's totally up to you. You'll want to lay out what the players stand to gain and what they have to offer in return. You can also institute a catch, so if the players decide to back out of the bargain, then something might happen to them. An example of this is maybe the players come across a ghost knight, and the knight would like his shield back, as that will let him pass on into the afterlife. So if the players recover the shield before he passes, he'll agree to aid them in combat against a powerful devil that lives in the dungeon. And so in return for helping this ghost knight pass on, he'll provide them some martial assistance in a combat against a dangerous enemy, something like that. Experiment tricks are all about interactivity. The players make choices, and their combination of choices results in something happening. This can be obvious, like pulling the levers in that force field room and seeing the force fields come down, or it can be a little less obvious, like pulling a lever and something happens deeper in the dungeon that they haven't seen yet. Experiments can be all sorts of things, like combining different substances or levers and buttons, or implementing different energies, and so on. There's lots of different combinations you can use here to have experiments within your dungeons. An example here would be maybe the players come across some alchemical ingredients and a brewing station. So the players can choose to make a potion, but there's enough overlap between the ingredients and limited quantities of them that they can only choose to make one potion. So they get a choice in what potion they want to brew, but they can only make one. False appearance tricks. These are tricks that have an element that appears to be one thing when it is in fact another. An example of this would be a giant painting on a wall that is in fact a door to another area. So it's appearing to be one thing, a painting, but it's actually another, a door. Hazard tricks are something that look similar to a trap, but often they aren't hidden or concealed to the players. So an example of a hazard would maybe be a chamber filled with lava, or a hazy purple mist that obscures the rest of the room, so the players have to enter it without knowing what lurks inside. Magic area tricks. These are tricks where an area plays a role. The trick will affect the area when it activates or triggers. So an example of this would be maybe the players can step into a magic circle, and if they do unadulterated, it will result in them being trapped in stasis. But if the players choose to alter the magic runes in some sort of way, it instead infers a haste-like effect, offering them that sort of advantage. Magic thing tricks. Magic things is a super broad category, but it generally involves interacting with a central feature that is magic in nature. So the players take some sort of triggering action, and in result, something happens to them. An example of this would be players praying at a magic statue of a goddess, and as a result, being inferred some sort of blessing or benefit for some period of time. Run the gauntlet tricks. These are tricks that involve a series of tests or challenges for the players. Often there is a rule that the players can adhere to help them safely get through the gauntlet if they are able to figure out what that rule is. So an example would be maybe the flagstones of a room are decorated like game board pieces, and if the players step on the wrong colored flagstone, they incur some sort of penalty of some kind. Maybe they take damage or a monster is summoned, something like that. Substance tricks. Players can often be faced with dangerous or nasty substances. Maybe the byproduct of an alchemical processing plant has resulted in some sort of caustic ooze filling up the large areas of this room that the players now need to cross. Wager and game tricks are exactly what they sound like. They involve some sort of game or bet. The players often have to put up something in order to risk earning a reward. An example here would be maybe playing a game of dice with a genie, and if the players lose, they give up some years on their life, and if they win, they are allowed the ability to fly up a nearby chute, allowing them access to a different level in the dungeon. Written tricks often confer some sort of information or knowledge of benefit to the players, assuming they are able to decipher it or view it. An example could be a magical script on a stone wall that is only readable when a dwarf of a certain clan is within proximity of it. So now that we've generally defined what tricks are and we've talked about some different types of tricks, we must ask the question, what makes a good dungeon trick? I think there are a few elements we can consider when we're designing our different dungeon tricks. First, we need to make sure the trick affords agency to the players. When it comes to the trick, we need to let the players make informed choices. Then when they've made their choice, they'll receive some sort of consequence from their actions that could be good or negative, depends on what they've decided to do and how they've interacted with your trick. That brings us to the second element of a good trick, which is it should have significant and notable consequences. When the players make their choice, they want to see the impact on the game. That means when the players are interacting with their trick, you need to show them some sort of outcome. Of course, the outcome can be good or bad depending on how they've manipulated the trick to their own benefit. To make good tricks, I think we also need to consider the balance of risk versus reward. I think that most tricks should have some sort of positive or interesting effect for the players. If all your tricks have only negative outcomes, then the players are just going to learn to ignore them. And that would be a real shame because we want our games to be fun and engaging for our players. So if we're presenting elements that only discourage engagement through this learned behavior of all these tricks are only giving me bad things, well, then we've lost a good opportunity to add these interesting elements into our games. If your trick is 100% negative, then I would be clear in making some signposts and showing the danger to the players because your trick really is just a trap. I also think good tricks enhance and define the space they are found in. Tricks are one of the methods that players explore our dungeons. Players like learning about the different areas that they're delving into. If we give some thought on how the tricks show the players information and give them more context for the dungeon that they find themselves in, then that's great design at work. If we have a trick where the players need to manipulate some sort of elemental energies to make a sarcophagus slide away and reveal a treasure vault, we're showing a lot of different information to the players all at once. We're showing that these elemental energies were maybe important to this sorcerer queen that resides in this tomb. We're also showing that the designers of the dungeon were smart enough to implement these magical entrapments into their design work. And we're showing that the queen had these prized possessions that were valuable enough to hide away from would-be grave robbers. So that's an overview of tricks and the different types that are out there for our use. As I've said, I'm sure you already use different tricks in your dungeon design, even if you don't actively think about them as tricks. Consider checking out the Tome of Adventure Design. There's a lot of great tables in there to help you design different tricks, including the ones in the different types I walked through earlier. I do feel like tricks are an important component of our dungeon design. They enhance the player's ability to explore the space. They can help you tell the story of your dungeons through the player's own abilities to interact and manipulate the dungeon space around them. And it gives the players a way to feel clever and successful when they solve these different tricks outside of avoiding traps and defeating monsters. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like. It really does help the channel out a lot. Consider checking out Enchanted Nimbus, my monthly newsletter. Thanks for hopping aboard the Earthmote, and I'll see you in the next one.